The pasuk says, "Ki lo yel alechem levado yichya ha'adam, ki al kol moitza pi Hashem yichya ha'adam." It's brought from Arizal in the Likutei Torah that we're not referring to the moitza pi Hashem that's separate from the lechem. We're referring to the moitza pi Hashem that lies in the lechem itself. When a person eats lechem, the chelek hagashmi is mechaya the guf, and the moitza pi Hashem in the lechem is mechaya the neshama of the adam. So Arizal ki lo yel alechem levado yichya ha'adam, the person isn't chai just as a result of the lechem gashmi that he eats, but al kol moitza pi Hashem yichya ha'adam, the moitza pi Hashem that's in the lechem itself is mechaya the neshama of the adam. When we come to learn the sugyos of lechem, those are of the most complex sugyos that there are in Ketzad Mevarchim, and we are particularly margish the moitza pi Hashem, which is the pnimius and the sheirish of the sugya of lechem. To understand the oimek of the sugyos of lechem, we'll begin the sugya be'ezer Hashem this week, and we'll continue bli neder and conclude in the various shittas Rishonim next week bli neder. But be'ezer Hashem should try and b'siyata d'shmaya be able to accomplish some clarity in the sugya amuka of chavitza. We'll begin with the sugyas hagimara on page 6 of the Maramakomis. Omar Rabbi Yosef, Hai chavitza de isbei pirurin kezayis. Rashi explains that a chavitza is ke'ein shalonei cook shemefarim b'soicha ilfos lechem. Ilfos is similar to a kedera. It's a makam bishul, and as we'll see, mefurish and tesis and menachas as we proceed, that the chavitza b'pashtos that Rashi is referring to is lechem that is undergoing a process of bishul. So the lechem began as ordinary lechem, and mefarim, it's then crumbled into an ilfas, into a makam of bishul, into a kli bishul, and undergoes a bishul. To which the Gemara says, if the pirurim, if the pieces from the crumbled lechem have a kezayis, bitchilo mevarach olav hamoitzi lechem min haaretz ulebasoif mevarach olav shalosh brachos. Then the pieces of the chavitza have the din of lechem. They're mechayev hamoitzi lechem min haaretz as a bracha rishona, and birkas hamazon after the achila. In short, they have the full status of lechem. The less be pirurin kezayis, if however the chavitzas, the pieces, the pirurin, no longer have a kezayis, betchila mevarach olav beri minim mezoynois, ulebasoif bracha achas mein shalosh. Rabbi Yosef is coming to establish the din of lechem, which is crumbled and in Rashi then cooked. What the din of that lechem is, benegea to hamoitzi lechem min haaretz and birchas hamazon. Now Rashi, when explaining what Rabbi Yosef now is going to find when he says Mino Amin Allah, what is Rabbi Yosef looking for a raya for? So Rashi says a davar pele. Rashi says Mino Amin Allah the apirurin kezayis mevarech hamoitzi. Rashi says that the discussion of the Gemara that's going to follow now is whether or not a kezayis requires the bracha of hamoitzi, or a kezayis perhaps has the bracha of beri minim mezainis. Now, b'pashtus, when we see this Rashi is a pella. What should be the reason why pirurim, which are a kezayis, shouldn't have hamoitzi? Why not? Or do we find that there's a din that pas is different than any other oichel, that on a kezayis there wouldn't be a din of hamoitzi lechem min haaretz? What's the havamina of the Gemara here? What does Rabbi Yosef need to bring a raya for? We'll recall in one of the earlier limudim in Ketzad Mevarchim, we saw that the Rishonim are tereach to establish a raya that bracha Rishona is different to bracha Achrona, that whereas bracha Achrona requires a shear, bracha Rishona doesn't require a shear. We saw Rashi in Masechta Sukkah, Tosfos in Masechta Sukkah, Tosfos later on in Ketzon Nevarchim, that the Rishonim prove that bracha Rishona doesn't require a shir, bracha Achrona requires a shir. But we haven't found the tzad that the bracha Rishona should require something else than a kezayis. A kezayis is a shir achila b'chol makom. So Rashi seems to be saying, how do we know that on pirurim of kezayis, that pirurim kezayis mevarach hamoitzi? Why shouldn't there be hamoitzi on pirurim kezayis? What's the sugya here? Mm-hmm. The cook? Because you're? Oh, so in other words, what you want to suggest in Rashi is that Rashi doesn't mean that it's pure and kezayis. It means that Rashi is discussing whether or not bishul changes the status of lechem. Okay, let's bear that pshat in mind, and we'll try and see if that will work out in the sugya. That will be the first ta'ara. What's the raya of Rabbi Yosef? Rabbi Yosef's raya is Haya oimedu makriv menoches b'Yerushalayim, a brayso that we learned last week. Oimer baruch shechiyonu v'kimonu v'giyonu lazman hazeh. Didn't that we discussed HaRav Be'ez Hashem in last week's limud what the bracha of shechiyonu is coming for? Notlon la'ochlon mevorech hamoitzi lechem min ha'aretz. Utoni alo v'kulon poisesois kezayis. Kulon poiseson kezayis. Zok Rashi v'kulon poiseson. Keloimar boitzon koidem kmitza va'oisa oisam psisim kezeisim. The Gzeres HaKosov is, Rashi says, because posos oisa pitim, the mincha has to be crumbled. Alma psisim kezeisim mevarchim aleim hamoitzi. So we see that psisim of a kezayis, the bracha that's made is the bracha of hamoitzi. That is Rabbi Yosef's raya. Now, what is the sugya according to Rashi? So before it was suggested that Rashi, perhaps we'll say Rashi is lav dafka when Rashi is discussing whether or not psisim kezayis are mechayev bracha. But what we're really discussing is whether or not bishul is mevatel from teiras lechem. That's what we were suggesting before. So when Rashi says that we're looking for if psisim kezayis has a din of hamoitzi, the issue isn't so much psisim kezayis. The issue is whether or not bishul is mevatel from teiras lechem. In addition, Rabbi Yosef has a din that we can only say, for a reason that Rashi doesn't explain, that bishul is not mevatel lechem. Bishul is not mevatel lechem from teiras lechem, as long as it has a shir of kezayis. Now, what the connection between shir kezayis and bishul is, if we understand that mahalach in the sugya, Rashi doesn't explain. Rashi again tells us that what's the raya of Rabbi Yosef? Rashi says, Alma psisim kezeisim mevarchem aleya hamoitzi. But the way we're suggesting initially is that really what the Gemara is proving is really not this. The Ikeh Chiddush of the Gemara is that bishul is not mevatel from teiras lechem. Rabbi Yosef adds that we can only allow that bishul shouldn't be mevatel from teiras lechem if the pesisim retain the shir of a kezayis. That's very sosom in Rashi. Rashi Keseda says, Alma psisim kezayis mevarach aleim. And similarly, Rashi didn't explain to us the connection between psisim kezayis and bishul. What does one have to do with the other? I'm sorry? That lesson in the kezayis is mevatel miteiras lechem. Yeah, Rashi doesn't, and that's an excellent diuk, and we'll come on to that in a moment. Rashi doesn't seem to say that that's part of the sugya b'chlal. This is the first ha'ora which we have to be medayik in Rashi, that on the one hand, seemingly, there shouldn't be a bechlala discussion of psisim kezayis or not psisim kezayis, but meidach gisa Rashi doesn't seem to be mashma that the sugya is a sugya of bishul being mevatel miteiras lechem. And riatas Rashi is sosum how kezayis and bishul somehow combine to retain teiras lechem. We find though that Tosfos in Masechta Menachos on Daf Ayin Hey Amud Beis, Tosfos in Masechta Menachos says mufurish, which is not as clear as Tosfos in Ketzon Nevarchim. Tosfos Dibur Masel Chavitza. Tosfos in Menachos says Pirish Bakuntrus Tabshil. A Chavitza is a Tabshil. Rashi by us just says that the lechem is put in the elfos. Rashi doesn't say mufurish, it's a Tabshil. Tosfos in Menachos brings Lashon Rashi that it's a Tabshil. And Tosfos says Shehabishul mivatloi kan miteiras lechem. So in Tosfos and Menachos, we find that Tosfos says mufurish that the nidin of Rabbi Yosef is bishul mevatel miteras lechem. Therefore, according to Rabbi Yosef, bishul is mevatel miteras lechem, but somehow bishul is only mevatel miteras lechem where the pirurim are less than the kazayis, but not where the pirurim are a kazayis. Tosfos doesn't give us any explanation what the connection is between pirurim kazayis and bishul being mevatel miteras lechem. What does one have to do with the other? A second kasha, a kushya atzuma, which in the sugya, the Pnei Yeshua and the Nachlas David ask, but the actual kasha is already not a kasha on Rashi, but is asked by the Rash in Masechta Chala, where the Rash in Mishnah in Perek Aleph Mishnah Hey, the Rash b'toich dvarov says that there is no discussion as to whether or not, there cannot be a discussion as to whether or not bishul is mevatel miteras lechem. There's no such subject. Why? Because we have a Gemara mufureshes about that, and the Gemara explains what the din is. There's a Gemara in Brachos, a daf later from the sugya we're learning on Lamed Chesem days, page 8 of the Maramakamis, where the Gemara is discussing the din of shlokos. Shlokos is a yerek which is cooked. It's shaluk. It's boiled. And the shaila is what the bracha of a yerek shaluk is. So the Gemara then has a general discussion as to whether bishul demotes the bracha of a meichel from, in the case of shlokos, from Beir Pri Adama to a shahakol. So the Gemara makes a comparison, and the Gemara says, shlokos mevarchem aleim Beir Pri Adama. That's the memory of Darash of Nachman in the name of Shmuel. Then the Gemara says, "V'chavreinu hayordim eretz Yisrael umanu ulam mishmei Rabbi Yochanan Omar shlokas mevarach shakal nia b'dvaroi va'ani oimer b'machloikes shnuya." Shlokas is a machloikes tanoim. What's a machloikes? A braysa in the halachas of Hilchas Matzah. A Gemara in Pesachim and Dafim Aleph. Yoitzim berokik hasharui ubemevushal shaloi nimoyach divrei Reb Meir. Rabbi Yossi oimer yoitzim berokik hasharui avaloi bemevushal afal pishaloi nimoyach. So we have a machloikes in the halachas of matzah. A rokik just means a matzah. Like rikikim. Can you be yoitze with a matzah that's mevushal? What's the din of a matzah that's mevushal? Zokt Rashi, the Tana that holds loy b'mevushal, desu lav lechem ikrei. Once it's mevushal, it's no longer called lechem, and that's part of a broader sugya that the Gemara in Daf Mem Aleph in Pesachim discusses, that whether or not b'negea to other dinei haTorah, when even if something initially is baked, it's first ofui, and then it becomes mevushal, is the bishul mevatel teras lechem? Is it mevashal it's teras afiyah? It's negea legabe if bishul can be mevatel tzli in Hilchas Pesach. It's a broad sugya if bishul is mevatel the previous din that the Meichel had. So the Gemara says benegea to matzah, if bishul allows it to retain teras lechem, is a machlokes tanoim. According to Reb Meir, you can be yotze with mevushal as long as it's not nimoyach, and Rabbi Yossi says you cannot be yotze mevushal despite the fact that it's not nimoyach. Not nimoyach means it's retaining two risa de nahama. It doesn't mean that now it's been nimoyach, which means it's become molten, but it still retains. The very fact that it's undergone the process of bishul itself alters and is mevatel in the way Rashi says it's mevatel at Shem Lechem.
Do we have a definition of teresa nahama yet?
We do not have that, and Be'ez Hashem that will come in the later part of the limud today, and we'll be mashing that b'lineda in the limud tomorrow, in the limud next week. Frek the Pnei Yeshua and the Nachlas David, how could Tosfos in Menachos say that Rashi's sugya of chavitza is if bishul can retain teras lechem, which then, according to Rabbi Yosef, depends on the pirurim have a kazayis or not a kazayis? That's a machlokes tanoim. So any raya that Rabbi Yosef is going to try and bring, if it is mevatel miteras lechem or not mevatel miteras lechem, is a machlokes tanoim. V'oid, what's the maskon of the Gemara Daf Lamed Chesed days? The Gemara, as we'll recall, is trying to compare bishul being mevatel teras lechem to bishul being mevatel teras pri Adama, so that the bracha becomes shahakol. The Gemara wanted to compare that the machlokes amiroim by shlokas, if shlokas becomes a shahakoil instead of a boyer pri hadoma, is the same as whether or not a matzah mevusheles has Torah's lechem b'negea to be yotze chayvas matzah. The Gemara no. The Gemara is madche. Kulei alma shlokas mevarchem aleim boyer pri hadoma. The kulei alma bishul doesn't alter the status of a meichel. What's the machlokes b'negea to matzah? Zok the Gemara, ad kan lo kom Rabbi Yosi Hassam, ela mishum deboinon ta matzah v'leka. It's not to do with the fact that bishul is mevatel teras lechem. It's because bishul alters in some way the tam of the matzah, and the mele, if it alters the tam of the matzah, so you can't be yotze. It's exactly kosev. We need tam matzah, and the machlokes is bishul mevatel tam matzah. So ask the Pnei Yeshua and the Nachlas David. So therefore, lefi the maskonas haGemara, there's no Tana that holds that bishul is mevatel miteras lechem. So oibazoi, we have the tchi of the Gemara that seemingly bishul shouldn't change teras lechem. So oibazoi vaitel maskana. What's Rashi's sugya if bishul should or shouldn't change teras lechem?
No, bishul is never mevatel teras lechem.
Azoi fegen the Pnei Yeshua and the Nachlas David. We'll recall though that Tosfos in Menachos says mefurish that the nidin according to Rashi is Shabishul mevatloi. Was tutman? Tosfos seems to say mefurish that is Rashi sugya. Meidach Gisa, the Achronim are pointing out that can't be Rashi sugya. And to be miyashiv shitas Rashi, and we'll come back Beis Hashem to see in the more b'harchova the mahalach of the Achronim b'shitas Rashi. But in order to answer that, the Achronim say Einochanami Rashi is lav dafka. So you were being matzia before that Rashi sugya is a sugya of is bishul mevatel miteras lechem. And that's why we find the sugya of whether or not kezayis could still have a bracha of hamoitzi, which we asked, where do we find that hamoitzi ever needs a shear of that there's a biyatzad that maybe we need somehow more than a kezayis, a different shear than kezayis? We only find by bracha kezayis is a shear. The Pnei Yeshua and the Nachlas David say the sugya can't be a sugya of if bishul is mevatel miteras lechem. Now, what Rabbi Seinu, the Pnei Yeshua and the Nachlas David don't explain as clearly is, if so, what is Rashi sugya? So now, if Rashi is lav dafka, and as we'll see, the Pnei Yeshua and the Nachlas David say that the Gemara happens to be speaking about the case of chavitza because that's a common case of being mefara lechem. And why we're being mefara lechem? We're being mefara lechem in order to make out of it a chavitza, which happens to go into an ilfas. But that's not the point. The point is, instead of speaking about someone being mefara lechem for no reason, we spoke about the preparation of the chavitza because that's a common case. That's what the Pnei Yeshua and the Nachlas David say. But be'etzem, the fact that it undergoes bishul afterwards doesn't change the din. The sugya is whether or not pirurim of lechem have a bracha of hamoitzi. So it is a hadrakushal l'duchta. What's the sugya? Now, if we go back to our sugya on page 6 of the Mareh Mekomos, we'll see briefly Tosfos at the top of the Amud Dibur Maskil Chavitza. Tosfos asks a kasha on Rashi. How could Rashi learn that it's mevushal? Tosfos says, how could we learn that it's mevushal? V'im toimar, first of the narrow lines at the end of the line. Ve'eich medamer Rav Yosef perurei menachos leperurei chavitza. Where's Rabbi Yosef's raya that the pirurim of kezayis have a bracha of hamoitzi? The raya is from the psisa of menachos. Tosfos, menachos aren't cooked. What happens to menachos? Rashi says, what case are we speaking about? Rashi d'Maskel Parchon, you look on the left-hand side, lemenachos ha'afuyois al hamachvas v'al hamracheshes koidem kmitza. We're speaking about minchas machvas and marcheshes, where they are, machvas there's a difference between a machvas and marcheshes of the depth of the keli in which the mincha is prepared. Some of it has less shemen, some of it has more shemen. If it's roises on a base of a thin base of shemen, or on more shemen, depending on the oimik of the kli. We're not speaking about menachos, which bichlawin is bashal. Where is bishul is sugya? If zok Tosfos, Rashi sugya is like Tosfos understands in menachos, that the issue is bishul mevatel miteras pas, and then, like was said before, we're just proving that where a kezayis remains and somehow bishul is not mevatel teras lechem. So what was the raya from menachos? Menachas, there's no bishul. Frek Tosfos, v'im toimar ve'eich medam Rabbi Yosef pirur menachas leperuri chavitza. And for Tosfos, v'yesh loimar, kevon shenitagnin b'shemen kinizbashlu domi. Since they were metugan, so therefore that is like bishul. Now, when were they metugan? When did this mincha undergo tigun? It underwent tigun in the process of making it. It was speaking about minchas machmas and minchas macheshet.
Can you explain us how mincha is made?
So what we have is the mincha is nilosh b'mayim, and then placed inside either a machmas or marcheshes. That is, and Tosfos describes that as a process of tigun, which means it's not nefa in a tanur, it's netagin b'shemen. And then after that, the mincha is removed. The mincha is then undergoes psisa. Rambam says then it has an additional matan shemen, and then it's necha.
So it doesn't get. Does it actually get hard before it's taken out?
I mean, it's
hard and crumbled.
Yes, in some way, the mincha once it's prepared in the keli isn't nitagin. So frek the nachlas David, and in Poskim that's asked the kasha, same kasha is asked by the Pri Megadim. That monofshach, if the amount of shemen clearly doesn't change the status of the lechem to pasabor bekisnin, horaya that the Brisa says that the bracha that's made is hamotzi lechem in aretz. That means we're speaking about a quantity of shemen that doesn't change it from having ordinary teras lechem. So where should the lechem the mincha lose its status as a result of undergoing the bishul? Ordinarily, what happens is something acquires teras lechem al yedei afiyah, and then subsequently undergoes a process of bishul. Here, the mincha was nitagin in how it originally became lechem. So monashach. If in the Brisa it says on a minchas machmas and marcheshes, despite the fact that it's nitagin b'shemen, has a bracha of hamoitzi, so it's lechem. Where's the bishul that's being mevatel it from teras lechem? The fact that originally it was nitagin b'shemen, so what? Nitagin b'shemen doesn't mean it can't have the status of lechem. Elomai, the matan shemen afterwards, up the Pri Megadim, the matan shemen afterwards is b'tzainen. That doesn't change the lechem. So the achronim are being matmiya. How is Tosfos comparing a mincha of machmas and marcheshes, which was prepared originally with a component of shemen and not through afiyah, if that preparation with shemen and the fact that it was nitagin is still sufficient that it should have a teras lechem, so it's lechem. So now all that happened afterwards is when your paisa says you crumbled it. That's not comparable to chavitza, where after it was baked, it then underwent a separate ma'aseh bishul. Bishloima in the case of chavitza, where it was lechem and then underwent bishul. So then, possibly we could say, the way Tosfos is Mavurim and Nachas B'Pashtus, and the way the Achronim understood Tosfos, the Pnei Yeshua and Nachas David, we now have a question: is bishul going to be mevatel a previous status of lechem? But him imanoshach, the fact that it was netagin originally b'shemen clearly doesn't deprive it from being able to have hamoitzi and birchas hamazon. The Brisa says on a minchas machmas and marcheshes, the bracha is hamoitzi. So what is Tosfos gaining that the fact that it was nitagin mitchila now means that it's somehow comparable to the shaila of bishul being mevatel teras lechem? This is the pliya that the Achronim ask. If you want to see it in the Poskim, if we turn to the Shulchan Aruch pages in the Maramekayim's book, in Siman Kuf Samech Ches, on Sif Yud, which is page 183 in the Maramekayim's pages. It's on the Shulchan Aruch pages. So that's where the basic din of the Shulchan Aruch is brought, as you can see, chavitza. Now, if we could then turn 2 pages further to page 185. Almost at the bottom of the page are 2 columns of Eshel Avram, the Pri Megadim. The second column, the left-hand column, Diber Maschel Va'agav, it's in bold. There's the words Va'agav. Masha Kosu Atoisishom Diber Maschavitza Menochais Nitagnin B'Shemen. Zok the Pri Megadim Eini Yoidea Mahi. I don't understand what Tosfos is saying. Im koidem shepoises, if we're talking about it was nitagin b'shemen, as part of the process of preparing the mincha for pesisa, and he says, ukanira mimerutzas divrei haMagen Avraham, and that's the way the Magen Avraham, and we'll come back, Be'ez Hashem, to the Magen Avraham. The Olam learned the Magen Avraham together in the Chana. Kanira mimerutzas divrei haMagen Avraham, ma bekach, the achar pesisa lo nitagin. What relevance does it have? What change is the mincha going to have in its din because it was netakin before psisa? After psisa, nothing happened. V'ayim barambam perik yud gimel michas ma'aser karbanos achar psisa yoitzek shar shemen. Even though the Rambam says that after psisa, what remains, the shemen remaining in the lug that wasn't used during the tigun, is then poured into the psisim. He says, Harei shar shemen loy nitagin achagach. It's not a tigun, it's a cold pour. Otu, is there a tzad that if someone pours shemen on psisei pas, that it will lose its din of pas? So it's not the Pri Megadim. Bishloim elishitas haTosfos, which we'll see in a moment. That Tosfos understands chavitza means pirure pas, which were then bonded together, were combined together. Tosfos at the end of Dibra Masel Chavitza, Tosfos will say that the nidbakim yachad. So Tosfos suggests that perhaps pouring shemen in psisim will also possibly l'shitza Tosfos create a shaila of whether or not it's teras lechem because it's pure passion nidbakim, and therefore there's a ponim chadashos here. But in Rashi, that the sugi is a sugi of bishul. Frek the Pri Megadim, how did Tosfos explain Rashi's pshat in the sugya that Rabbi Yosef proved his question if bishul changes past from the fact that a mincha is netagin b'shemen? And this kasha of the Pri Megadim is a kushya tzuma on Tosfos. In Menachos Shurim, the kasha was said over on Tosfos in Menachos b'shein the Briskirov bleibt schwer on the kasha. Pasha pshat in Tosfos is a pella. In fact, we should add a point that's negei lahalacha, if we just remain on that page, on page 185, in the Pri Megadim for another moment, just a few lines before the Dibra Masel v'agav ugara, which we just learned together, just to mention a din, that's negei lahalacha. So the Eshel Avram, Dibra Masel v'have, says the following. He says, v'have yoidea kizayis bibishal, Afshem mefarer achar habishol lepirurim dakim, keben da habishol loy mapik milechem shahoyo be'ez bishol kezayis, su achar kach ukshem mefarer dak loy megareya. Zok the Pri Megadim azv. Maybe we could suggest the following pshat in Tosfos. We asked, as the Pri Megadim himself goes on to ask, that the fact that it was netagin when it was originally prepared, if despite that it retains its teras lechem, haraya the brachas hamoitzi, so then pirurim afterwards is no comparison to Rashi's sugya of bishul being mevatel teras lechem. So that the Pri Megadim, maybe we could suggest the following: that the sugya of pirurim that won't change teras lechem after afir, and it's only bishul and pirurim that will affect the teras lechem. That's only where the lechem originally was baked. But perhaps if the lechem originally was metugan, then perhaps that will then establish that the lechem status of lechem is not identical to lechem that was baked in the first place. And therefore, pirurim will be able to detract from the teras lechem if originally the lechem wasn't offered. So here we start to hear a suggestion of maybe a Pesach b'shitas haTosfos. That Tosfos is somehow comparing bishul after afir, that if we see that somehow bishul undermines the teras lechem, then zok Tosfos that even if the lechem was nizbashal mitchila, it was netagin, and does despite that have a teras lechem, but somehow that teras lechem is more sensitive to the pirurim that happen afterwards, and then it will be nizbashal miteras lechem. Zok the Pri Megadim in Svara, there's no such thing, and that's what he's saying here. He's saying, if there was a kezayis b'shas bishul, afshem mefarer achar kach bishul lepirurim dakim, Kevon deha bishul loy mapik milechem shahoyo be'ez bishul kazayis su achar kachu kshem mefar dak loy megareya kimay pirurim beloy chavitza v'hu adin knedlach kahai gavna afshem mefar achagach v'tzorach iyon b'chol zeh. Zot the Pri Megadim haga ba'atzmacha on our Gemara. What does our Gemara establish in Rabbi Yosef? Let's go back to the straightforward case of bishul. What's the din? Lu Yitzuya, he was mevashel, but the pirurim had a teras lechem because there was a kezayis. If then you would take that and be mefar it further, would it change the din? No, it depends on what the din is. So we see that even something that undergoes bishul, as long as it had a shem kezayis to retain shem pas, it won't be affected by pirurim later. Zot the Pri Megadim oibazoi, even if it was nizbashel mitchila, if it had a kezayis b'shas bishul, the pirur afterwards shouldn't affect it. What's the difference between if it went through afiyah, bishul, and then pirur, or if in the first place it was nizbashel and nonetheless it had teras lechem and then underwent a pirur? Either way, bishul, if it's less than the kezayis, undermines teras lechem in Tosfos' understanding of Rashi. So if where it has a kezayis, it didn't undermine teras bishul, so my nafkamina, if it was baked, cooked with the shir kezayis, and then mefurur, then a case where mitchila it was mevushal bekezayis, and then afterwards it was mefurur. Memela zot the Pri Megadim, I don't understand how Tosfos can suggest that because it was metugan mitchila, that therefore it was nispara afterwards, it should be nisbatal miteres lechem. And Ladina, if we look in this suffix of the Pri Megadim, of something that has a kezayis b'shas bishul, and afterwards it was nispara, if it still retains the original status of lechem because the bishul at the time didn't undermine it, or do we say that once it has its teras lechem only through bishul, somehow that can be affected by pirur? Is brought by the Bir Halacha Ladina Afanart. So in the pages of in this same page, on page 183, if we go just below the Eshel Avrom, that I'm sorry, on page 183. I'm sorry, one page back. I apologize. Page 183, very bottom of the page. There's two columns of Bir Halacha. Let's look at the left-hand side. Zok the Bir Halacha. First, there's a yud and then an asterisk. Im yesh bahem kezayis. Ein ba Mishnah Berurah. V'ayin ba Pri Megadim shem mistapik. Im achar abishol hoyo kezayis v'achkach pura lepirim ktanim. Im neimo kiven shehoyo be'ez bishol kezayis. Suloi nifkam imei shem lechem al yidei shem im itoy lepoches mi kezayis. So the halacha, the din of the Bir Halacha brings this suffix of the Pri Megadim and isn't machriya. It isn't machriya. But the stoma of the Pri Megadim is that, and that's the basis of his kash on Tosfos, that avada it should not be nifka. It's just kedai to point out just a very practical shaila that the Chazon Ish asks. He says, if we're going to say that la'achar bishul psisa should then be megareya teras lechem, so how are we ever going to have the din that when they had the kezayis b'shas bishul, it retains a bracha of hamoitzi? When you come to eat it, you're being peises it. So the Chazon Ish just says b'soich dvarov that avada, when a person comes to be peises it to be oichlei miyad, then avada that's not going to be megareh. He says dilavkin lo mashkachas lo, that there should ever be a din that kezayis has a bracha of hamoitzi. And we'll come back to explain, even though the Chazon Ish obviously is saying a milsa de mistabra, that's kimat muchach in the sugi, because otherwise, where's there ever going to be such a case of psisa kezayis that will retain the bracha? As soon as you come to eat it, you will mayat it. We'll try and explain that svara as we go through the sugi. But homios, we have a kushat suma that the Pri Megadim is asking on Tosfos, that once something has a teras lechem, there's no reason to say that the fact that originally it was prepared through bishul should affect teras lechem. So hadrinon, that's what we will try now establish in Shitas Rashi, is that mi'idach gisa, the Achreinim are saying that Rashi's bishul is lab dafka. It's not a sugya of dafka bishul being mevatel miteres lechem. And then we have to understand, so what's the issue of kezayis or pachas mikezayis? And then we try and come back and try and understand what Shitas Tosfos is. Tosfos clearly says in Rashi, bishul is being mevatel miteres lechem, and Tosfos somehow is comparing to tigun. So what we'll see first is how the Nishmas Adam, Chai Adam, learns al derech lenachlas David in the Pnei Yeshua that Rashi's bishul is lav dafka, but the Nishmas Adam will try and explain what's then the sugya of shir. What's the sugya here of psisa? So if you this Nishmas Adam is on the supplementary Maramakamis, printed on the right hand side of the page. Just because of time constraints, we'll just for the moment we'll leave out the Nishmas Adam's initial kashas on the sugya, which are a lot of the kashas that we've seen Be'ezer Hashem just now.
This is
we'll see his.
Baruch, I sent you a supplementary Marmakaimis in email.
We'll now see his mahalach in the Etzim sugya. L'chei nirali, the third paragraph. L'chei nirali. So there's copy the Chai Adam at the top of the page, which if you have time, Blineda will come back to see. If not, Blineda will discuss it next week's limud. There's two paragraphs of Nishmas Adam, B'Magen Avram and V'Achar Iyun, and then we have a L'chei nirali. The time of the Rabbi Yosef to severely the dafkal prusa gedoyle mevarech hamoitzi, aval pirure machmas kotnon loy chashivi levarech hamoitzi. Zok the Nishmas Adam. Be'etzem, the chashivos of the bracha of Pas should be made on something which has chashivos of a different type than all other birchas hanenim. And he proves this from the shita of the Ravid. Was steht in Ravid? Ukedas o Ravid hiviu abes Yosef da al pochois mikezayis Pas mevorech boire mina mezayis. Zot the Nishmas Adam, we find a chidush in Pas that we don't find by other birchas hanenim. Despite the fact, as we mentioned at the beginning of today's limud, that Rashi and Sukkah and Tosfos in a number of places prove that bracha Rishona doesn't have a shear. Zot the Ravid, but the bracha of Hamoitzi Lechem in Aretz is an exception. And the Ravid says Ladina that on Pochos Mikizayis Pas, the bracha is Borer Mina Mezayis. As I state in Ravid. Zok the Nishmas Adam, from there we see that the chashivus of the bracha of Pas isn't just like we learned in earlier sugyas, that it's because it's ishtani li'iluya, and it's karev lemenachas, like the Gemara said, memele its brachas is hamotzi lechem in haaretz. As we established then, the achila of Pas is an achila chashuv. It's a different achila. Memele zok the Nishmas Adam, be'etzem, we could understand that on what is made a bracha of Hamoitzi Lechem in Aretz, once we know the shear, the Fida Ravid, is not the same as other birchas hanenim, so maybe the halacha is that we need something called a prusa gedola, or perhaps we need a kikar. The dinim, that's bracha achrona, not bracha rishona. In there's a parallel, but in Zot the Nishmas Adam, in the Ravid we find that the bracha of Pas was nemar not just on the shear of the dumya to the shear of bracha rishona by other achilas, but we require a different shear for the chashivos of achilas Pas. And we'll come back to this in a moment, but we see a dogma of this in the Gemara later, where the Gemara is going to discuss that there's a maila of something that is bo mikikar gadol. The Gemara's maskana is, if we look just for a moment on page 6 of the Maramakomis pages in the Gemara says, Bebo mi lechem godoil. Pirurim that come from a lechem godoil have the chashivas of bracha. Zot Rashi, what does bo mi lechem godol mean? Zot Rashi, de chashive lemeheve lechem bebo mi lechem godoil, v'nishan min alechem shalei nifras kuloi. There's some of the original kikar left. So even though what the person is eating are prusais that are less than a kazayis, bomi lechem gadol is a maila. What does bomi lechem gadol do? The prusa that you're eating, seif kol seif, is less than a kazayis. The teretz is because the chashivus of achilas Pas isn't a shear in the etzem achila, it's a chashivus of achilas lechem. Zok Rashi that b'mokum that the lechem is kayom. So we look as the prusa as being eaten as part of a larger kikar. So it gives a chashivos to the ma'isa achila. Lashon Rashi in Menachos, b'vami kikar gadol, Lashon nifla of Rashi in Menachos. Zot Rashi, what's Bo Mikika Godel? Zot Rashi, Kigoin Shebo Milechem Godel Shadain Hu Be'en Hakikar Bo Shebom Bo Mimenu V'Have Choshev Ubar Brocha. Zot Rashi, the Pirurim have a chashivus because if they still are coming from a lechem sholem, then that gives them a chashivus and makes them a bar bracha. Zot the nishmas odom, we therefore see that the mechayev of the bracha b'moitzi lechem in haaretz is choluk b'yesoidoi than other birchas hanen. And therefore there would have been a tzad, we can now say in Rashi, that perhaps once it's not from a kikkor anymore, but it has the din of pirurim, then maybe even if it has the din of kezayis, it's not choshuv lemeheve bracha. What's the bracha b'moitzi lechem in haaretz mechayev? Bracha on a davar choshuv. What's a davar chashuv? A kikkar. Or in the lashon of the Nishmas Adam, a prusa gedoyla. It's different than shar birchas hanenin. Memele zot the Nishmas Adam, if we're going to learn, and this goes back to your shaila, that the sugi in Rashi of bishul is lab dafka, and we don't learn like Tesis is mashma, b'pashas and menachas, that the issue is an issue of bishul. So what's the sugya? The sugya is the shear of chashivos for an achila of hametzi lechem in haaretz. And that, we'll just touch on this briefly, is this broad discussion in Rabbi Seinu Achronim, if we find the concept that the shear of kezayis is not just a shear in a maisa achila, but is a shear in the chashivos of an object. Ordinarily, we understand the pashtus, that's the way Reb Chaim was mashrish it's brought in Grachal Hashas, and in other places, Reb Chaim was mashrish that shear kezayis is a shear in a maisa achila. HaRav, the mandamar chatzi shir osam and atera means it's the chefza, it's the object. There's no concept of shir, but we do find places in the Rishonim that kezayis does create a chashivos in the atzim chayfetz. We find, for example, in the shiurim of bittul, that the Gemara in Psachim, the way the Rishonim explain, has a tzad that maybe a shir kezayis v'chrei achilas pras of taruvas in taruvas doesn't allow bittul, and the Rash says because that's a shir chashuv. Similarly, the Ravid in Isser Mashu has such a loshon that b'mokum that something kazayis because it's choshuv memela it's ain't a bottle. How is the fact that the ma'isa achila is totally on kazayis create chashivos in the etzim chefza? Elomai, there are instances where we find that kazayis is a shir and chashivos gufa. Therefore, zot the nishmas odom lefishitis Rashi, the nidin of the sugya is: does kazayis establish chashivos for the bracha of a meitzi lechem in haaretz?
In this case, it's even more than a kazayit. It's bar milechem godol, a kikar godol.
So we'll come back in a moment to the chashivas to the swar of bar milechem god. But what the Nishmas Adam has established, and it would be kedai to see the l'shenas barichos. Time doesn't allow us to see it biyun. But this is the yesod that the Nishmas Adam is mashish. Now, what do we have from that? What we have from that is only a partial eitzah in Shittas Rashi, because as we recall, Taisa says that Rashi Shita is an issue of Shinu through Bishul. So what we've done is we've created a pshat in Rashi that the sugya is a sugya of psisim, because lechem is mechayev, it's separate chashivos b'negei to bracha, but we don't really have a Pesach for Shitas HaTaisus in Rashi. So here perhaps to be miyashiv, what Taisus means that it's nishtana al yedei Bishul, and also be miyashiv the kushei atzuma of the Nachlas David and the Pnei Yeshua, that we have a sugya mefureshes that bishul isn't mevatel teras lechem. So what's the shakla v'tarei v'agemara? So perhaps we can say like this: the Briskirov in Menachas stencil, and I didn't hear this in Shir because Shir doesn't we don't hear Shirim on Daf Ayin Hey, so I didn't hear the Briskirov mipi Shmua. It's only what is we can see from what's printed in stencil. The Briskirov says the following: is mechadish even further than the yesod of the Nishmas Adam. The Briskirov proves from the Pirush Mishnayos, the Rambam, and from an Ur Zarua based on a Yushalmi that in fact not just does less than kezayis not allow for the chashivos, like Rashi says that it should have a bracha of hamoitzi lechem in haaretz, but in fact it's mevatel from the lechem, it's teras lechem. For the chashivos of lechem itself, we require kezayis. Zok the Briskirov, now he says it in Shitas HaTaisus, and we can extend the Briskirov to Shitas Rashi. The Briskirov says like this. We touched on this before, that Taisus' pshat in the sugi is different to Rashi, and the Olam learned Shitas HaTaisus. that chavitza doesn't mean lechem shenis bashel, it means pure lechem, which are stuck together in the Lashon HaTosfos, which are stuck together al yidei merek, by yidei cholov, k'may chavitza detamri. It means it's a block, it's a cake that's created from sticking together, pirurim of pas. Zod Briskirov, where do we find that taking pirurim pas and sticking them together should be mevatel it miteres lechem? What's the sugi here? Zod Briskirov azay. Be'etzem, as soon as one's mefarer lechem, we have a discussion that perhaps the fact that it's pirurim and it's less than a kezayis should be mevatel a pas miteres lechem. That's a sugi. And as Mvur and Pershim Mishnayis, that in fact the reason why, according to the first hand of the Braisa, the Perurim cannot be less than a Kezayis before Rabbi Shmuel, the Tanakama the Braisa, is because if they're nispar less than Teras Let than the Kezayis, they lose the Chashivas of Achilas Mincha. Zot the Rambam and Pershim Mishnayis. Vice the Chois less than the Shir, says the Biskirov, affects the Chayfetz to the extent that the object loses its Chashivas. What's the Shakla B'Tayr of the Gemara? The Shakla B'Tayr of the Gemara is that the Biskirov is Einochanami once you create psisim less than the Kezayis. It might lose its Teras Lechem, but where we can still relate the psisim back to the original Lechem, even if their current state of Pachos Mikezayis, they lose their Chashivas of Lechem, but like in the Svar of Bo Mikir Godel, it retains their Chashivas. Zot the Biskirov, the Shakla B'Tayr is Chavitza changes the lechem, so we can't relate it back to the original lechem that the process came from. So the etzem fact of being pyrus lechem means that once it loses its shear, it loses its teras lechem. So what's the Shakla B'Tayr of the Gemara? As long as the pas isn't physically altered enough that we can still see it as being a part of the original lechem, it can still have the bracha of hamoitzi. Zok the Briskirov, Tosfos' sugya is that because chavitza has already been so altered by being nidbak into something that doesn't bear enough resemblance to the original pas, so therefore once it's less than a kezayis, there's nothing to allow it to retain its teras lechem, and less than the kezayis doesn't have teras lechem. That's what the Briskirov establishes from a Rambam Pershim Mishnayis and an Or Zarua al Piyah Yerushalmi. Therefore, Zot the Briskirov, the sugya is a sugya that Pachos Mikezayis loses its Teras Lechem. But what's the Shakla B'Tayr of the Gemara? The Shakla B'Tayr of the Gemara is how still can the Prusais be related to the original Lechem such that they can still retain the Chashivas of Lechem, not inherently, but because they're related to the original Lechem they came from. That's what the Briskirov says in Shitzat Tosfos. So now, and this will finish Be'ez Hashem and proceed to the Divrei Agoda, that possibly is the Pesach for Shittas Rashi in the Sugya also. Dainu. That L'shfi Shittas Rashi, when Tosfos says Bishul alters the Lechem, Tosfos doesn't mean Bishul altering the Lechem like the Sugya of Reb Meir and Rabbi Yossi by Rokik, Hashori, and Hamavushal. Because there the Achreinim say the Maskana of the Gemara is that Bishul doesn't alter Lechem. Avada, it retains the bracha of hamoitzi. You can be yotzei matzah. The only issue is tam matzah. What's Rashi's sugya? Rashi's sugya is that bishul doesn't allow the lechem to be related, the prusais to be related to the original kikar. Therefore, Zot Rabbi Yosef, once it is nifras to less than a kezayis, so therefore Zot Rabbi Yosef, now it can't, in terms of itself, it can't retain its chashivas of lechem legabe bracha. Because we know lechem, like the Nishmas Odom says, has its own dinim and criteria. B'negeata, being choshev for bracha. Now Zot Rashi, the only way it can have a bracha of hamoitzi is if it's related to the original kikar. Zot Rashi wants its nizbashel. Enochenami, it doesn't lose teras lechem mitzad its form, but it can no longer be meyuchas to the original kikar. Oy bazoi Zot Rashi. It depends on shir kezayis. Now the Briskirov, like I said, I didn't hear the Briskirov in Shir. It's only what we have in stencil. The Briskirov says it in Shitas HaTosfos, and we're extending it to Shitas Rashi. I think the reason why the Briskirov didn't say it b'Shitas Rashi is because the simple reading of Tosfos is mashma that the bishul itself is mevatel miteres lechem. Dugmas the way the Achreinim understood, but Lule, the way the Nachlas David and Pnei Yeshua understood, perhaps what Tosfos means that bishul affects teras lechem is because we're speaking about how closely it can be related to the original.
Rashi, mean Rashi.
Rashi. In Shittas Rashi.
Rashi.
Now, and this is a hatzor to the olam, and we'll proceed to the Divrei Agoda. Just a hatzor to him. It's a chiddush. But possibly, this could be a Pesach for the Kushiyat Sumo of the Pri Megadim. The Pri Megadim said that the Lechem was originally in his Bashal. Then it was Nisparer. If there was a Kazayis B'Shas Bishul, pure afterwards, doesn't change it. Then the Pri Megadim was said, perhaps the relationship between Pirurim and Lechem is different if it was offering Mitchila or when it's Bashal Mitchila. And the Pri Megadim was Mesupek, as we saw, the Bir Halacha brings that down. Possibly, we could be Matzia, that the Mokum to be done in the Svar of the Pri Megadim is because, like we said from the Biskirov, Be'etzim, when Lechem is Nifras, it should lose its Teres Lechem when it's Bachas Mikizayis. The only way is we can relate it back to the original Kikar so that it can retain its Teres Lechem. So perhaps we can be Matzia like this. Hani Mili, when we can relate it back to the original Kikar, is where the Purim themselves have Teras Lechem. They have the usual Chashivas of Teras Lechem. So their Purim that have Chashivas Lechem, just the Chisar and the Shir, can be related back to the Kikar. But where Mitchil of this is not the usual way Lechem is, but it's Lechem that was Nitagin B'Shemen, then we can understand the Svar of the Pri Megadim that Kidei, that the Purim should maintain Chashivas Lechem by being related to the original Kikar. That can change depending on what the way the original Kikar was prepared. And yesh lodun in that second chiddush. But what would be matzia lefi the Biskirov is we no longer need, perhaps lefi the Biskirov, if we are able to extend the Biskirov from Shittas Tais to Shittas Rashi, we no longer need to say that Rashi is completely lav dafka and Bishul doesn't factor in the sugya. Like the Pnei Yeshua and the Nachas David say, Lo Ilam Bishul does factor in the sugya. Once we have the hakdom of the Nishmas Adam, that the shear of Kazayis in Lechem is choluk b'yisoida from the shir of brachos, because we're speaking about kazayis in the etzem cheftzah b'negetel choshev lemehebe alei bracha. Maybe we can extend that to say that whenever pirurim are less than the kazayis, the only way they retain bracha is because in some way they're related to the original lechem they come from, and that's the chiddush of the Gemara that bomi lechem gadol means, like Rashi says, the lechem still has to be kayom, so the achila of the pirurim is seen as part of the lechem, but in the swara of Rabbi Yosef, the etzem fact that it can be related to the original lechem gives chashivos to a pachas mikashir.
That doesn't speak to Teresa Nehama. What's Rava's input?
Yeah, so we'll mention that. Be'ez Hashem and Blinei, there will be Isaac in a further limud what the sort of Teresa Nehama, and in fact, if the other wants to see in advance, let's discuss that length in the Nishmas Adam, how that relates to Shittas Rashi and the Nafkiminas. In the parsha, familiar pasuk, Vayishlach Yisrael es Yeminoi. Vayoshes al Rosh Ephraim v'hu hatzoyer ve'esmoiloi al Rosh Menashe sikel es yodov ki Menashe habechor. Rashi is already niskasha that the simple reading of the pasuk is a pella. The simple reading of the pasuk is that he was sikel es yodoi, so that the smoil went on the Yad Menashe because Menashe habechor. It's the opposite. Because Menashe is the bechor, adarabah, the Yad Yimin should have been on Menashe, and the Yad Smoil should be on Ephraim. So Rashi explains that when it says ki, it's not in the oifen of tam, it means despite. Despite. Even though ordinarily the dalad oifanim, that loshen ki is mishamish the dalad oifanim doesn't usually explain it as despite. But the Daskenim Ibali Ataisus there brings that we find an instance of a pasuk in Novi, brings a pasuk in Daniel, that we also find La Hashem Eloikeinu harachamim v'haslichois ki moradnu boy. Clearly from the pasuk, ki moradnu boy means the Rebbeinu Shem should be merachim and selech, despite the fact that we are mamored. Zok the Daskenim, so we have a smach to the way Rashi explains the pasuk that Sikel es yodov ki Menashe bechor means sikel es yodov despite the fact that Menashe is the bechor. Other Rishonim choilek on Rashi and seemingly won't accept Rashi's doichak in Lashitosam that ki could mean despite, and there are a number of different biurim in the Rishonim. The one that will be oimed on is a biur that is in the safe in the Chizkuni. The Chizkuni explains that the loshen sikel es yodov, which is an unusual loshen, ordinarily you understand is hever es yodov. The loshen sikel es yodov, he says the loshen sikel is in yone b'seichel u'b'chachma. It means it was done with insight, it was done with thought. Why? Because really what should have been done is Yaakov should have switched the place of the bonim themselves. He should have put Ephraim to his right and Menashe to his left. Why didn't he do that? Why was it just that he was Mesakel Es Yodov. Zok the Chizkuni, the reason why is, he says, Shaloi Rotza Levayesh Es Menashe Ki Hu HaBechoyer V'tzorech Lachloik Leikovoid Ktsas. So in Chizkuni stated Davar Nifla, that Menashe was given the covet of standing to Yaakov's right. That was his mokum. And mitzad that, he had the covet of a Bechor, which the Chizkuni says is called covet Ktsas. But however, mitzad the Yodayim, the Yad Yamin went on the Yad of Ephraim. That mitzad the mokum, he was given the mokum mechubed to the Yamin. But the bracha, which comes through the Yad, the bracha that was more mechubed, was given to Ephraim al Yadei Sikel Es Yodov. I saw in the Shmuzen of Naftali HaKohen Kopshitz Shlita, it's a sefer of droshes called Gam Yocholti, Naftali HaKohen Kopshitz, makes a beautiful zushtel to was steht in the Yavit Siddur by Leil Shabbos, that the Yavit Siddur says that the oifen to be mevarech bonim b'Leil Shabbos, to those who are knowing that way, is by putting both hands on the head of the child. It's Yodua, and the Bahalacha brings this in Nechas Kapayim, that the Gra in HaRav was machmer on this, because the Goyin held that only a Kohen can be mevarach b'shtei yodov. A Yisrael can't be mevarach dumya to a Kohen. It's part of the Issa Deraisa for Yisrael to be mevarach b'Kohenim. Bahalacha discusses this in the beginning of Nechas Kapayim. And he brings that the Gra held that to be mevarach b'shtei yodov is al derech birchas koyanim, and therefore Yisrael should be mevarach bonav only b'yad achas. There's an arichas, a discussion on this in the Siddur Grav Naftali Hertz, the oimek of this hayrah of the Goin. The Yavitz is chaylik, and the Yavitz says that avada the oifen to be mevarach bonim is b'shtei yodayim. And he brings a very interesting tushtal, fascinating tushtal the Yavitz brings. He says because Keimotzinu b'malochim she'omru Chazal shemanichim yedeim al roshei shel adam k'shemevarchim oisei. The Chazal that malochim on nislave to the bias of the adam state manichim yedeim al roshei and mevarchim oisei. So you see that the ikatzura of bracha is b'shtei yodayim. Of course, that's not a raya keneged the gra; it's malochim. But what the Yavitz is proving from there is that the ikka oifen of being mevarach is b'shtei yodayim. Zok the Yavitz u'mashe motzinu b'Yaakov Avinu olav hashalom shebirch Ephraim u'Menashe kol echod b'yad achas. So why then is the paradigm of bracha yisimcha lekim Ephraim u'Menashe b'cho yivorchu Yisrael? Why was that b'yad achas? Zok the Yavitz lo yishahoyse eino tzara ela mipnei hahechrach huchrach lasis kein kedei shalei lahatil kino beineim. Why? He says, "Kiven shebo lefana bevas achas lekabel berchosoi." They both came together. So he says, "Bedin hoya sheyakdim Menashe habechor." Really, Menashe should have been koydem. Als his covered, als bechor. Aber hu bocher beEphraim lahakdimoi, but lahakdimoi doesn't mean to give him first. It means to give him the greater of the two brachas. Kimoishe mepnei kach sikel yodov v'yoshes yad yimine al rosh Ephraim. The Yavitz, the same yisoid as the Chizkuni. Why did he have to be Mesakel Es Yodov? Simply be Mahapech them Mekoimis. The answer is because Be'etzem mitzad, like we said, mitzad the Mokom, mitzad the Kedima, Avad had to be in a sky that Menashe would be Koidim. Since they were Bob of Asachas and he couldn't be Makdim Menashe, Memele, he put him Biyaminoi. But Sikel Es Yodov to Mevarech like that. Had he been Makdim Menashe entirely, then he would have lost Zot the Yavitz the opportunity to give Naftali, to give Ephraim the greater of the two brachas, because then the entire Kedima and bracha would have been that of Menashe. That's what's mavur in Yavitz. Kum d'ch'ois that the limud of B'cho Yivorach Yisrael contains in it the sensitivity of Yaakov Avinu to the covered that Menashe deserved. Even though he wasn't going to be zoiche in the bracha that the Bechor was roy to, but the etzem covered the sensitivity to the covet of Menashe was goyim that he was either Lefila Chizkuni didn't do what should have been done of being Meshana the Mekaimis, and the Fida Yaiba to see a greater Chiddush that even though the Ikatsura of Bracha is B'shtei Yodayim, Yaakov Avinu relinquished that seder of giving a Bracha B'shtei Yodayim because he had no other way to preserve the covet of Menashe as a Bechor. Davar nifla v'shteita, both in the Chizkuni and in the Yaivet. Perhaps then we understand a sensitivity in B'cho Yevorach Yisrael, Yisimcha Lekim Kefraim B'chim Menashe. The limud that we're trying to give to the bonim, the sensitivity of what someone else has been on the chaveris. Sikel es yod of the whole arrangement of how the bracha of Menashe and Ephraim was. The Fida Yaivetz, it meant that really Yaakov should have called Menashe and Ephraim over first, but he didn't know what to do. So since they were boim ka'achas, he had an eitzah of being minded Menashe liyamin, but being Mesakel Yodov, because in the way that he wanted to give the bracha, if it would have been one after the other, and he was given the initial bracha to Menashe, then that would have been misbattled the oifen of giving the ikki bracha to Ephraim. Somehow we have to mekayim both dinim of the mokim and the ikki bracha. And Mele is at the Yavitz, even though the ikatsura is b'shtei yodayim, but the bonim are mevarach b'shtei yodachas. In the case of Yaakov, Nifla. Ilule that Naftali Shlita said this, it's Dvarim Leiroyim, but it's Kedai Tefiroi something that he said, which is Mavil Alarayim. He said that Chaim Oizer had a daughter who Le'aleichem was very, very unwell, and the Reb Chaim Oizer asked the Chafetz Chaim to daven for her refuah. And the Chafetz Chaim said, Ich kann nicht. That's what he said. So he says that it was known in Europe that the reason why the Chafetz Chaim said that, and Ilule that Naftali HaKayin said this, it's Tvarim Avilim. It's the Gedolei Olam. He said in Europe they said the Yedidus between Reb Chaim Oizer and the Chafetz Chaim, the depth of the Yedidus is unimaginable. They feared Klal Yisrael together hand in hand for decades. How could it be that the Chafetz Chaim said, "As ich kann nicht"? It's a natural rachamim. So the hezbollah that was common is that when Reb Chaim Oizer, and we're saying this bezihirus, and I'm saying it b'shmoy. Ordinarily, the divrei Torah that we speak here are usually dvarim that on Chadash. I'm saying over only b'shmoy. He said that the reason was because when Reb Chaim Oizer was a bacher, he broke a shidduch, and there was an issue of whether or not the meduberes was moicha. And the Chafetz Chaim Baruch Kodshe understood that this is the reason why the Reb Chaim Oizer was going through the tzara. And the Chafetz Chaim said that for her kepeda at kenish davening. That's what he said. The sensitivity of Ben Adam L'Chaveri. This is what we're trying to give over when we say Yisimcha Lekim Kefraim B'chim Menashe. The covered, the sensitivity to the feelings of another Yid. Yisimcha Lekim B'cho Yevorach Yisrael. In the sherish of the bracha of Klal Yisrael, Sikel Zot L'Chizkuni, it was nan b'seichelu b'tvuna. How to preserve the covet of his own grandchild. Yaakov Bechira Av was giving a bracha to his own grandchild. Because there's a sensitivity that if he moved Menashe to the smoil, it's taking away from his din of Bechira. So B'seichel, he kept him in the position, but Sikel es Yodov. And he was mevater on being mevarich b'shtei yodayim. This is the ikke bracha to Yosef that was being maimed shtei shvatim b'makom Yosef. La'olam that be shevet Menashe and shevet Ephraim. This is changing the tzur of Klal Yisrael. But the bracha was nema with the yad achas to preserve the dignity of Menashe Kuah Bechor. That's the limud of B'cho Yevorach Yisrael. From that sensitivity comes bracha. The last part is not mine. It's Misamra B'Shmei of Naftali HaKayin, it's Kopshit Slita, and Ilule that he said it, and he said that was Ibadja B'Mei Midrash in Europe at the time. We would have no reshus to even entertain such an idea. But that's the limud that's the limud that we learn. Mela, that's the zustel that perhaps we can make al pidvarov to das was steht in Chizkuni and the Yavitz, and that's the sherish of where bracha and Klal Yisrael be'ezras Hashem will come.
Mincha.